The school bell was a lie. It promised routine safety, the measured rhythm of a Tuesday morning. It clanged at 8:15 a.m. on May 7th, 2002, and a wave of children spilled toward the double doors of Maple Ridge Middle School. But for two of them, the bell was a final, terrible punctuation mark. They were inseparable, walking shoulder to shoulder, their worn canvas backpacks bumping in sync. Henry Clarke, 13, skinny and all sharp angles, adjusted his glasses, his attention already drifting toward the science lab. Beside him, Ryan Miller, also 13, was a compact force of boundless energy, his hand gripping a basketball he wasn't supposed to have inside. They were a perfect match, the dreamer and the doer, the thoughtful artist and the fierce protector. They passed the front office, exchanged a familiar, slightly mischievous nod, and disappeared into the surging hallway traffic, heading toward their 7th grade homeroom. They went inside. A simple, unremarkable action. Children enter school 1,000 times a day. But on this morning, the walls of Maple Ridge Middle School, the same walls built to nurture and protect, seemed to simply absorb them. 8:30 a.m. Homeroom attendance. Henry's seat was empty. Ryan's seat was empty. The teacher, Mrs. Davison, made a quick note. Tardy. Probably talking by the lockers. 9 a.m. First period. Still empty. 10:15 a.m. Recess. Their friends looked for them by the basketball court, then by the art room. No sign. It wasn't until 1:30 p.m., when the principal, Mr. Davies, was preparing for the afternoon announcements, that the low-level hum of concern suddenly spiked into a deafening, cold silence. Henry's mother called, asking if Henry had remembered his lunch. Mr. Davies assured her he hadn't seen the boys. Ryan's father called 5 minutes later, a desperate edge already in his voice. They hadn't just skipped class. They hadn't gone home. They were simply gone. No trace. No note. No forced entry. No shattered window. Two boys, 13 years old, had entered a fortress of rules and supervision and dissolved. What would you do if your child left for school and never came back? The search began quietly, then explosively. Police lights fractured the quiet suburban streets of Maple Ridge, Oregon, a town accustomed only to the gentle rhythm of seasonal change. The sun dipped below the tree line, painting the empty school parking lot in shades of bruised purple and ominous orange. The town held its breath, waiting for a simple, logical answer. They'll be found at a friend's house. They just wanted to run away for a few hours. But the night deepened, and the only certainty was the bitter, terrifying fact. Two best friends vanished at school. For 4 long years, their disappearance would baffle police, parents, and an entire town. A cold, sickening void. The case was a tombstone erected in the heart of the community. Until one evening, years later, when an accidental grass fire, burning through an abandoned field just beyond the old school boundary, exposed the one thing nobody expected to find. When the fire department arrived to put out the blaze, they thought they were just fighting flames, but what they discovered beneath the ashes would reopen every wound this town tried to bury. Maple Ridge had always prided itself on being the kind of town where you didn't lock your doors. It was a neat grid of quiet streets, manicured lawns, and old-growth trees. The kind of place people moved to specifically because it felt safe enough to raise a family. That idyllic, brutal peace shattered on May 7th, 2002. Henry Clarke and Ryan Miller represented everything good about that suburban dream. Henry, a budding intellectual, spent his allowance on graphic novels and complicated science kits. He was naturally reserved, happy as sketching detailed drawings of imagined galaxies in his notebook. His best friend, Ryan, was his connection to the bustling world. Ryan, meanwhile, was pure action. He was the star on the middle school soccer team, a natural leader with a smile that could dissolve tension. But underneath the athletic exterior was a core of deep, unwavering loyalty, particularly to Henry. He was, quite simply, Henry's shield. Their morning was routine, comforting in its predictability. Mrs. Clarke watched from the porch as the boys walked down the drive, Henry clutching his worn, bright blue backpack, Ryan spinning his basketball one last time before tucking it under his arm. They walked the half-mile route, cutting across the Petersons' lawn, their voices muffled and easy. They passed the familiar, fenced-off field behind the school, a vast and used expanse of dry grass that was always marked as no trespassing. They entered Maple Ridge Middle School at 8:15 a.m. The first wave of true, immobilizing panic hit Ryan's father, Mr. Miller, when he arrived at the school at 4 p.m. The principal had called both families, suggesting they come in. As Mr. Miller walked toward the main entrance, he saw Mrs. Clarke pacing on the front steps, tears already blurring her eyes. She wasn't panicking. She was frozen in an absolute, deep terror. "They're not here, David," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "They checked their lockers. Their books are still inside. Everything is there, but them." The official search began swiftly, but it was futile. Police scoured every hallway, every locker, every classroom. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers leading them through the library, the gymnasium, the echoing cafeteria, and a maze of classrooms. The school's interior smelled of desperation and disinfectant. Nothing. Not a trace of a struggle. Not a dropped shoe. Not a single loose thread of fabric. By sunset, the building stood dark and silent, a cold, empty tomb. The police had one brief, tantalizing moment of hope. They pulled the school's elderly, semi-retired janitor, Mr. Frank Peterson, into the office for questioning. He was a quiet man, a fixture in the school for 20 years. He claimed he saw the boys near the gym, an area where the back hallway met the maintenance corridor, around 9 a.m. They were talking to a teacher, a man, he stated clearly, tall, dark hair. "I saw them talking, then they walked down toward the back." But then, as Detective Hayes pressed him for details, who was the teacher? What were they talking about? Mr. Peterson's face went blank. "Wait," he stammered, rubbing his hands together. "Maybe it was earlier. Maybe it was just one boy. I can't be sure." His initial clear statement had dissolved into confusion and contradiction. The police had their first lead, but it was already tainted with doubt. And one teacher's statement would later raise more questions than answers. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frantic, disorganized searching. Helicopter sweeps cut through the quiet night air, their powerful beams dissecting every patch of woods and overgrown field. Posters plastered every storefront and telephone pole, the familiar, smiling faces of Henry and Ryan staring out at a terrified community. Detective Lena Hayes took point on the case. A single mother with a reputation for meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail, she felt the weight of the parents' suffering like a physical burden. "We are treating this as an abduction," she announced publicly, though the sheer lack of evidence mocked her professionalism. The police focused on two immediate problems: the janitor's vague statement and the possibility of a runaway attempt. Rumors, toxic and immediate, exploded across Maple Ridge. Some whispered the boys had simply run away, fed up with school. Others, older, darker rumors, suggested something sinister had been happening inside the walls. Maybe something happened inside school grounds? The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Clarke and Mr. and Mrs. Miller, were united in their torment. They launched their own desperate public appeals, the exhaustion and fear etching permanent lines on their faces. Then a twist. 3 days after the boys vanished, the Miller family received a small, folded piece of paper left anonymously in their mailbox. The message was crude, scrawled in hurried block letters. "Look closer to home." Mrs. Clarke received an identical note 1 day later. It was a classic tactic, misdirection intended to sow discord and suspicion among the families. But Detective Hayes was uneasy. The sheer proximity suggested the sender was local, watching them. The notes added emotional weight to an already agonizing situation, deepening the sleepless nights and the communal fear. The case was moving too fast, fueled by grief and gossip, and simultaneously too slow, devoid of any concrete, reliable evidence. Hayes was running on fumes, chasing every possible lead, however thin. She interviewed every student who knew the boys, every teacher, every administrative assistant. And then, just 3 days after their disappearance, the crucial piece of the puzzle that might have held the truth vanished. Detective Hayes went to the school's main office to review the security camera footage. The school had a basic, antiquated system that covered the front entrance and the main corridor leading to the gym. The IT specialist looked at her, his face pale with confusion. "Detective, I can't access the files," he stammered. "The footage from Tuesday morning, May 7th, between 8 a.m. and 10:00 a.m. It's been completely wiped. There was no mechanical failure. The system log showed that the files were deleted, not corrupted, but intentionally purged from the main office computer. Someone had been inside the office. Someone had the access code. Someone had removed the crucial evidence of the boys' final moments. The ghost in the machine had just confirmed everyone's worst fears. The answer wasn't outside the school, hiding in the woods. The nightmare was buried inside the building, and whoever was responsible had just erased their tracks. The deletion of the security footage wasn't just a setback. It was a screaming confirmation that the person responsible was either staff or someone with intimate knowledge of the school's inner workings. Detective Hayes moved the investigation focus entirely inward, away from the woods and highways, and onto the faculty roster. One name immediately stood out: Mr. Harlan. Daniel Harlan was a substitute science teacher. He was new, having arrived at Maple Ridge Middle School barely 2 weeks before the disappearance. He was temporary, easily overlooked, and unsettlingly quiet. Hayes pulled his personnel file. His references were sparse, and his background check, while clean on the surface, revealed a prior incident at a different district in Idaho. The records were intentionally vague, citing an inappropriate boundary concern that resulted in his resignation, but no formal charges were ever filed. The lack of paper trail made him professionally safe, but legally suspicious. She brought him in for an informal interview. Mr. Harlan was cooperative, almost unnervingly so. He expressed sincere sadness about the boy's disappearance, recalling Henry as a bright kid with a curiosity for chemistry, and Ryan as a good influence on his quieter friends. When asked about May 7th, he claimed he was teaching a standard chemistry class all morning, with several witnesses. His alibi held up. He seemed genuine, but Hayes, hardened by years of watching people lie, noted the almost too perfect smoothness of his account. He never fidgeted. He held eye contact without blinking. He was a mask of professional grief. The investigation stalled in this frustrating middle ground: a suspicious teacher with a shaky past, a contradictory janitor, and a deleted video. The town of Maple Ridge was now consumed by fear and distrust. Parents kept their children home. The very idea of the school, once a haven, had become a source of dread. Just when Detective Hayes considered filing Mr. Harlan away as a professional red herring, a new, vital piece of information surfaced. A student, a quiet 6th grader named Sarah, came forward, shaking. She hadn't wanted to speak before, intimidated by the police and the grief. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. "I was cutting through the back during recess," she told Hayes, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw them, Henry and Ryan. They were near the old storage sheds behind the school field." The storage sheds. This was a restricted area, a dilapidated cluster of outbuildings used for storing old gym equipment, lawnmowers, and chemical supplies for the pool. A place the students were strictly forbidden to enter. It was located right beside that unused, fenced-off expanse of dry grass. When police checked the area, the sheds were locked. They were covered in cobwebs and undisturbed dust. But when they checked the ground around the sheds, the silence broke. Behind the farthest shed, where the concrete met the overgrown weeds, they found signs someone had recently been there. The dry, compacted dirt was disturbed, faintly showing the impression of footprints. 2 pairs of small, sneaker prints, and 1 pair of heavier, adult boots. And then, small, heartbreaking artifacts. A few fibers of torn blue fabric, consistent with the shade of Henry's backpack. A tiny, chewed-up pencil with a cartoon astronaut. one of Henry's known possessions. It was the first actual, tangible evidence found on school grounds. The boys hadn't run away. They hadn't made it past the gates. They had been led to the restricted area. Police searched the sheds, tearing the flimsy wooden structures apart. They used ground-penetrating radar on the surrounding soil. They dug. They sifted. But again, the same agonizing conclusion. No bodies, no proof, no answers. The trail went cold immediately after the shed area. It was as if they had reached a wall. The evidence suggested the boys were there, but whatever happened next, whoever took them, had been ruthlessly efficient. Months bled into years. The missing persons bulletin faded from yellow to white, then was peeled off the walls entirely. Henry and Ryan became the ghost story of Maple Ridge. Parents moved away, driven by the cold fear that lingered in the air. The school rebuilt its reputation, replacing old equipment and increasing security. But in the back of everyone's mind, one question burned, silent and terrible. Where did Henry and Ryan go? It was 2006. Maple Ridge had managed to achieve a fragile, uneasy peace, the memory of the missing boys deliberately softened by time. The school continued its routine, carefully avoiding the subject of May 7th, 2002. The old field, the vast, unused stretch of overgrown land adjacent to the school boundary and the storage sheds, remained fenced off. It was a local landmark of unease, but otherwise ignored. On a scorching August evening, the peace shattered again. A massive grass fire broke out in the abandoned field. The cause was likely a careless discarded cigarette or spar from a passing car, magnified by the dry, unforgiving Oregon heat. The blaze was swift, tearing through the dead summer grass and low scrub brush. Firefighters arrived within minutes, battling the relentless flames that licked the chain-link fence separating the field from the school grounds. It took hours to bring the fire under control. The field, once a sea of dry yellow, was now a scorched, black landscape, still steaming. Firefighter Mark Jensen was performing the final sweep, dousing embers near the perimeter fence, when his boot snagged on something unusual. He glanced down at the dark, uneven ground. The intense heat had burned away the topsoil and roots, exposing the earth beneath. And there, protruding from the freshly exposed soil, was something stark white and unervingly geometric. He knelt, pushing the charred soil aside with a gloved hand. It was a bone, not an animal bone. Too small, too delicate, and unmistakably human. A wave of cold dread washed over him, extinguishing the lingering heat of the fire. Forensics were called in immediately. Under the stark glare of police floodlights, the scene was meticulously excavated. The shallow grave, hidden for 4 years beneath the roots and soil, had finally been exposed by the purifying, violent act of the fire. Beneath the ashes and just inches of scorched earth, they found 2 small skeletons, lying side by side. They were intertwined, almost embracing, silent testimony to their desperate final moments. The dental records confirmed the town's worst, most painful fear. They were Henry Clarke and Ryan Miller. 4 years of searching highways, tracking leads, and fearing kidnappers had ended here, in the dirt of their own town, just yards from where they last saw their parents. But it wasn't just their remains that shocked investigators. The fire had revealed not just the victims, but the meticulously concealed secrets of their final hours. It was what was found buried with them that would finally crack the case wide open and reignite a nightmare the town tried desperately to bury. The forensic team worked through the night, the field now a consecrated, tragic crime scene. The remains were carefully removed, but the focus shifted to the objects found nestled within the shallow grave. The items the killer had carelessly, or confidently, left behind. 3 objects held the key. 1. A broken school ID. It was plastic, melted around the edges by the fire, but the photo and name were grimly recognizable. Mr. Harlan. Daniel Harlan, the substitute science teacher who had maintained such a perfect composure during his interview 4 years earlier. 2. A rusted padlock. It was a heavy-duty lock, and the markings matched the specific brand used on the school's maintenance sheds. The very sheds the boys were seen near. 3. Fragments of duct tape and a keyring. The keyring was cheap, plastic, and bore the school's logo. It was of the kind issued only to staff, granting access to various utility rooms. DNA testing on the remaining adhesive of the duct tape would prove crucial. The renewed police investigation was swift and targeted. The first step: find Daniel Harlan. He had disappeared a week after the boys went missing, not 4 years earlier. Detective Hayes remembered the internal memo. Mr. Harlan requested immediate, unpaid leave citing family reasons. At the time, with no evidence linking him directly to the case, the school had granted it. He had slipped away, quiet as a ghost. A national missing persons bulletin was cross-referenced. Daniel Harlan had not been missing. He had been hiding. Investigators quickly discovered he had been living for the last 4 years under the alias Daniel Price in a quiet, isolated suburb of Nevada, working a low-profile job in construction. It took 3 days to track him down. The warrant was signed instantly. When detectives finally knocked on the door of Daniel Price's small, nondescript house, he answered calmly, his expression unchanged from the measured neutrality Detective Hayes remembered from 2002. He didn't even try to run. He just looked at the badge, and his face registered a profound, defeated exhaustion. What they found inside his home confirmed everyone's worst fears. Tucked away in a dusty box in his closet, they found a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It wasn't a diary. It was a cold, disturbing record of observation. The entries were dated to the spring of 2002, detailing his interactions with students. But the final entries, written in the days following May 7th, were damning. They did not explicitly mention murder, but spoke in chilling, coded language about the necessity of silence, and entries about 2 boys who trusted me, ending with, "The earth accepts all secrets. Now I am finally safe." The journal was the key. A full-circle moment of agonizing truth. Daniel Harlan was not just a suspect. He was the architect of fear that had plagued Maple Ridge. The interrogation was a brutal exercise in emotional pressure. Daniel Harlan, or Daniel Price, was a cool, calculating subject. He denied everything for the first 3 hours. He claimed the ID must have been lost. He claimed he left the school to escape the scrutiny, not because he was guilty. "I didn't kill those boys," he stated repeatedly, his voice flat. "I saw them talking to the janitor near the gym. That's all." Detective Hayes countered with the physical evidence. The location of the grave, yards from the maintenance sheds he had access to, the remnants of the duct tape, and finally, the journal. She read the entry back to him, her voice low and steady. "The earth accepts all secrets. Now I'm finally safe." Harlan's composure fractured. The mask dropped. He pressed his face into his shackled hands and began to speak, his confession a choked, agonizing torrent of details. He admitted to luring the boys back to the maintenance shed. He claimed he wasn't planning anything violent at first. He told Henry, the curious scientist, that he had a secret chemical experiment to show them. Ryan, the protective friend, went with Henry. Once inside the shed, Harlan quickly locked the heavy padlock. When the boys realized the trap and tried to scream, things turned violent. The confrontation was quick, desperate. Harlan had used the duct tape to silence them, but they fought back. "I didn't mean to hurt them," he sobbed, the words empty and self-serving. "They were going to tell. I couldn't let them tell. Not again." He described the horrific logistics, moving the small bodies under the cover of darkness, just after midnight, to the unused field, digging a shallow grave with a spade he kept in the shed, and burying the truth inches beneath the playing field they should have been running across. The truth, after 4 years of tormented silence, had finally unfolded. The emotional focus now shifted entirely to the victim's parents. The Clarkes and Millers were brought into the police station. They didn't need to see the gruesome pictures. They just needed to hear the words that confirmed their deepest fear and ended their 4-year vigil. Mr. Miller was rigid with white-hot rage, while Mrs. Clarke simply crumpled, The sound of her grief, a raw, terrible sound in the sterile environment of the station. Closure was not comfort. It was confirmation of the worst kind of evil, hidden in plain sight. Justice was finally on its way. Daniel Harlan was charged with 2 counts of murder. But one last detail, found buried deep in that journal, revealed a chilling twist even the detectives weren't prepared for. The final pages of Daniel Harlan's journal were written with a strange, panicked urgency. They weren't just self-reflections, they were accusations. He wrote about the difficulty of the burial. He wrote about the heavy tools and the need for another pair of hands. He wrote about an assistant, someone who helped him silence the boys and, more crucially, helped him dig the grave and dispose of the evidence. Hayes immediately focused on the DNA evidence recovered from the duct tape found in the grave. The tape had 2 distinct adult DNA profiles, Harlan's and a second, unknown male profile. The unknown DNA was run through the Cody's database and, more importantly, cross-referenced with the remaining staff records from 2002. The result was a cold, sick punch to the gut. The second DNA match belonged to Frank Peterson. Frank Peterson, the school janitor, the man who first claimed to have seen the boys near the gym talking to a teacher, but whose statement had quickly dissolved into confusion. The man who had likely been covering his own tracks from the very beginning. Hayes recalled Harlan's initial deflection during the interview. I saw them talking to the janitor near the gym. It wasn't a lie. It was a partial, desperate truth. Turns out, the janitor and Harlan had not been strangers. Detective Hayes, digging back into Harlan's past, discovered that Frank Peterson, the longtime Maple Ridge janitor, had worked for a brief period at the same Idaho school district where Harlan had his prior boundary concern. They had been partners in a previous and proven scandal years prior, an arrangement of mutual, destructive control. Peterson had been the accomplice, lured back into the darkness by Harlan's sudden presence at Maple Ridge. He had likely used his staff keyring to open the shed, help Harlan move the bodies, and then deliberately derailed the initial police investigation with his vague, contradictory statement. He had also been the one who had the access codes and the motive to wipe the security camera footage. It wasn't just one monster hiding in that school. It was 2. But there was a final, bitter twist of irony. Frank Peterson had died in a small, private retirement home in 2005, a year before the fire. He had taken his secrets to the grave, dying peacefully while the parents of Henry and Ryan continued their tortured, 4-year search. Justice could only be partially served. Daniel Harlan was convicted on all counts. The details of the trial, the chilling journal, the fire-exposed grave, the DNA evidence, shook the nation, forcing a reckoning with the lack of background check scrutiny afforded to temporary staff and substitutes. The case changed school safety policies nationwide, mandating stricter screening processes and greater transparency in personnel files. For the Clarke and Miller families, the closure was heavy, a burden of truth rather than a relief. For 4 years, their parents searched fields, forests, and faces in crowds, driven by the desperate hope that their sons were merely lost. They never realized the truth lay buried beneath the very ground their children once played on, hidden by the trusted faces of the school's staff. The families created the Henry and Ryan Memorial Foundation, dedicated to providing specialized training for school administrators to identify and flag predatory behavior, ensuring no other child would be lost to the darkness that hid inside Maple Ridge Middle School. The lives of Henry and Ryan, the quiet artist and the loyal athlete, were extinguished tragically early. But their final resting place, the scorched earth of that abandoned field, became the place where the truth could finally grow. Their legacy became a vigilant light, shining on the dark corners of the education system, demanding accountability and protection for every child who walks through the school gates. If this story moved you, share it to keep their memory alive and to honor the changes their tragic loss brought about. And tell me, what would you have done if your child vanished like this, and the truth was buried just yards away from where you stood every day? Comment your thoughts below. If you want more real stories that uncover the truth behind unsolved cases, subscribe. Because these stories deserve to be told.